I think we are live now.
Oh, you did the one-way thing, hardcore user.
All right, so you want to walk us through this one?
Yeah, can you slide down a little bit?
Yeah, let me just zoom out a little bit so we actually have a chance.
And go ahead and slide down until you see this first set of code. Okay, so the goal of this is sort of a follow-on. We've been doing some changes to diagnostic source, and we actually knew that we would probably do it in two stages. So the first stage was what we call the W3C, support. So they have a different kind of ID than the one we were using previously, and we wanted to basically add the capability of supporting different IDs in system.activity. So system.activity is the thing that allows us to flow what you're doing through the system. And not surprisingly, when a request comes in or a request leave, you want that information to come in via those requests and sort of flow through the system, and then also be propagated to any requests that you make to other machines. And so people like App Insights are very interested in making this stuff work, and that's the partner that's being blocked if we don't do this. So we did, the first round was just enough so that they could support the new style of ID. But then the next thing that we knew that we also wanted to do in 3.0 was to do sampling, because they wanted it on all the time. But you can't have it on all the time unless you sample, because it's just too expensive otherwise. And it turns out also that the W3C ID has support for a sampling bit. So the idea is, along with the ID, there's this flags field. There are 8 bits in the flags field, but only one of them is defined so far. And that bit basically says, this is a request that I think you should log. It's actually only a desire that it be, because if you send too many of these, the guy has the right to say, you are sending me way too many requests for recording, I'm only going to do some of them. But still, the ability to propagate that desire is valuable. So that's what the first part of this. There are 2 parts of the API change, and the first part is basically activity needs to have these flags as part of its state. In the same way as it had the ID, we also wanted to have the flags. You should be, so when you are bringing activities in, so you have your parent ID, you should be able to pass in the flags. We also allow you to set them, just because these flags don't, it's quite possible that you want to turn the recording bit on halfway through. You've decided that, you know what, for whatever reason, I've determined that this activity is important, and so I want to turn on the recording bit, because otherwise no one can turn on the recording bit. There has to be some mechanism to turn on the recording bit. So we create this new flags property. So we made up an enum, which has a 1-bit defined so far, and then we created this WCID flags, which is pretty much just a getter setter, and then we added a recording bit or a recording property, and all that does is mask off the recording bit of the flags. So it's a complete convenience. We could get rid of it, but it's also the main thing that you do with these flags. And so it was valuable to have that. And that's pretty much it. And this is very kind of, in my opinion, boring. It's just a 1 more byte. We actually expect this to happen again and again in the future. You can stuff things into what we call baggage or what's the other one called? Anyway, we have these key value pairs, but as we get canonical ones, we expect to just define, strongly typed versions, because people prefer strongly typed versions. It's less error prone, and it can be more efficient. So that's the first half, and I don't think there's a whole lot going on there. Okay, can you slide down a little bit more?
That's funny because I look at my own screen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can see.
I see.
More
Okay, so the second half is so far all we've done is we've allowed the recording bit to be propagated. But the question is who actually decides that something should be sampled? And it's also possible that too many recording bits have been set, and that somebody is going to have to decide to throw some of them away anyway. And actually, in the first version of this API, we tried to put some of that logic in activity into this thing, and we decided that was a bad idea. That there was too much that the clients of these people like App Insights would care about and want to fiddle with. And so pretty much all we did was we wanted to make sure that there was a way for them to get the hook that they needed to set these bits. And so, and that boils down to where you want to set these bits is when things from outside the system are creating activities for the first time, and then also when activities are leaving the system. Those are the points in which logging systems want a hook, because that allows them to inject policy, like decide to actually set the recording bit or not. And they can just set it to do it every 100 bits or every whatever. They can come up with whatever algorithm they want. And so all we did basically is create two new, a diagnostic source already has is enabled and write event. And we basically are adding two more, on activity import and on activity export. And then there needs to be a way that the client of these things can inject those, like say, these are the ones I want. And so we already had subscribe methods that took, the is enabled and the observer, the observer. And so now we also allow you to provide an on activity import and export. We expect the number of clients who actually do this to be exceedingly small. Basically, App Insights or people who are as sophisticated. If you don't need to do sampling, if somebody else is doing that for you, you probably don't need these. The other nice thing that these things do is that it gives them a hook at a very nice place, so that if we have forgotten anything or they want to change the semantics or whatever, they actually have quite a bit of flexibility to basically hack and beat us into submission because they have a hook at the right spot. So they might even use that. But the goal of this really is for them to do small amounts of policy. And pretty much what that means is setting the recording bit. And that's about it. So again, these things, as far as what's inside activity, does very little. The subscribe remembers the delegates that you pass to it, and then if someone actually calls one of these things, it forwards it on to every client in turn to get his chance to do something at that point in time, to use the hook.
Vince, I joined a little late. I may have missed it. Sorry, but sure. How do the two delegates passed to subscribe relate to the virtuals? Do the virtuals invoke the delegates or something like that, or yes. Is that left up to the?
So so on activity export and import are things that an instrumentation site will do. So, for example, when HTTP is reading in a request, we will modify the HTTP code site to not only do an is-enabled check and to write maybe something, but we will also, in this case, do an on-activity import. Now, what will happen is if any subscriber to a diagnostic listener, the question is, what does that do when I call that function? Where does it go? And the answer is whoever subscribed to it on the other side, and there could be many of them, there could be several subscribers, each one gets a turn to sort of, do something. And he was given the activity, and then this other thing, which is this, we just call it object. And that object will change depending on the code site. So for an HTTP request coming in, it's going to be whatever holds the state coming in. And if there isn't one conveniently that exists, you kind of have to make one. Someone will have to make one, and that would be unfortunate because it's another object that has to be allocated. But right now, the only instance that we know of is HTTP request, and it already exists, and so it's fine. Did I answer your question, Stephen? I'm not sure I did.
I'm not sure. It was interesting. So presumably we So I guess I can just go and read the implementation for the overrides here, but is it the overrides? So someone ends up calling diagnostic listener.onActivity export, and that's what triggers the delegate invocation for everyone who subscribed.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So in diagnostic listener, his implementation is it's already the case that diagnostic listener had this list of subscribers. That list of subscribers had the write event and is enabled for each subscriber. That each subscriber now also has a onActivity import and onActivity export delegate. And so what the diagnostic listener's implementation of onActivity import does is just spin through all of those subscribers, giving them a chance to have the callback.
Got it. So these are really like strongly typed callbacks or write operations or something where
we debated.
The call side is doing. Sorry.
So they are very much they feel in some ways like write object, but the difference if you squint properly and you could actually try to make this work by saying I have special write events or something that you call at particular points, and these are your callouts. But we after thinking about that for a little bit, we decided that was a hack because the point of these is to modify state. The point of write is not to modify state, is only to sort of log and to sort of send them something down the pipe. And moreover, is we expect write to be very common. We expect any client to override write and do stuff with. We expect 0.01% of the people who are subscribers to care about this. If they don't care about sampling and really sort of advanced mutation of state and wanting the hooks, then they don't need to do any of this. Which is another advantage of not burying it in the existing API.
There are reasons to do explicit callbacks instead of just make it an event.
Instead of you mean an event like a C# event? You mean? So
that has a subscribe, unsubscribe.
We're following the pattern that has already been established. There's also unsubscribing to C# events has always been sort of mushy and painful, because you don't actually get a handle to it, and so when you unsubscribe it, you have to use the delegate as the handle, and it's kind of a pain. What this was trying to do is was trying to be not IEnumerable, the other one is IObservable. Thank you. It's trying to follow the IObservable pattern, but then you need more callbacks besides just next. And so these are sort of those. And it definitely does have things that you don't like. Subscribe is starting to get painful. It's already got 4 things. What if we needed another one? Now it's 5, and it's and the value is that, or the mitigation to that is that very, very few people will ever care about this one. Is really what and so it's only complicated for the people who need the extra feature. But you could certainly imagine doing it other ways. But this is the one that follows the pattern that's already been established.
And I think you just said this, but just to reiterate, the reason you made these actions rather than IObservers is just that you're never going to be completing it?
Well, making it an IObserver makes it even more complicated. IObservers are, having implemented them myself, IObservers have a non-trivial overhead.
They definitely do, yeah.
And so I did not want to make it more complicated than it needed to be, is why I did it.
Okay.
You could have imagined them being IObservers.
What is that is enabled callback?
That already existed.
Okay.
And so a diagnostic listener has a diagnostic source has 2 fundamental APIs. One is write.
Yeah.
And the only reason why write isn't enough is because in order to write, you need to create a payload object. And so you don't want to do that when it's off.
Sure.
And so we have is enabled and write is the ones that have existed already. So there's already other subscribe overloads that went this far. And in fact, all I did was, make two, this one have two new that have default parameters.
And it's already func string object bool? For those
Yes, all of these have already exist. I'm not, the only two that are new are these. These are just following the overloads that are already there.
Okay. So people who are familiar with this API already know what that signature means.
Yes.
They already know what those objects are.
Well, and except for the on activity. So there's quite a long paragraph of explanation on these two because they are. It's hard to explain them which is very unfortunate. Like you prefer your APIs to be so obvious that you can explain them simply. And this one, I basically have to say, well, these are when you're coming in from the outside world. Even explaining that requires a bit of text. And moreover, is that there's no guarantee that any particular instrumentation site has instrumented with one of these on activity import or export. Like they don't have to. So there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. The good news is that the number of sites where this is important, I think I can count on my fingers.
Okay.
And we own them all. So that mitigates this.
Okay.
And that's pretty much it. That's the name of the thing. I don't know if you care about the on or, but it feels reasonable. It really is. When you're importing or exporting an activity, when it's coming from the outside world or coming in from the outside world or leaving to go to the outside world. And there is at least a little bit of documentation on how it's supposed to be used. And that's it.
With the previous screen,
Yes.
we do have a guideline that says do not use the suffix flags in an email.
I'm happy to remove it.
But I do also see that it does actually match what they call it in the spec.
Yes.
You called it record ding, and they call it record dead.
Oh, I'm actually happy to. I didn't realize that. I was assuming they actually. So recorded sounds a little bit weird to me because but I'm happy to follow the spec.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking for what it is. So assuming that this is the trace state.
Yes, it is.
Trace state flags defines bit 1 as record dead.
So I'm happy to change that.
And then says that if you made a decision to record it, you should assert the flag. If it comes in and it is already asserted,
it's fair. It's fair to say that someone made that decision earlier, and so it is kind of past tense. So changing it to recorded is reasonable.
And then I don't have a super strong opinion about the use of flags because we have the conflicting guidance of this is the word flags is in the spec here, and our guidance says don't use the word flags. So,
but generally, we've been following the other specs whenever possible.
Yeah. So
just in order to minimize confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and everything else we did try to mimic that spec.
Yeah. But like the wire name for it, at least what they have as the example header is TRACEFLAGS.
Yes.
So.
Okay. Cool.
Should this be typed as a byte then? If it's literally a byte in Erlang implementation?
The framework really likes enums being ints.
Yeah, the earlier version of this, I did make it a byte, and I said, you know what, I can avoid that in the API, and so I made it a normal enum. Realistically, everyone should be using literally those enum values. Like, there's no reason to go outside of those, and we'll never define one that's outside the 8-byte range. We just won't. So it feels like it's not a problem. Internally, the internal implementation, I actually do only use a byte.
Sure.
Why not?
Yeah, so I think we should rename recording to record dead to match the spec.
Sounds good.
And I'm fine with the resolving the two conflicting rules in favor of match the spec.
Yeah, so the one thing we shouldn't do here is I just checked. So we already have this overload here.
Yes.
Which means we should not mark this guy as optional. Because otherwise it's ambiguous. I think the compiler will probably still bind to the other one, but
the compiler will still prefer the first one. The question is, do we expect people to call this with only an on activity export?
So basically, you're asking whether we should remove the optionality from both.
Yeah, like if we expect people to call this with either with just export, then you kind of want to have on-activity import. Either you want on-activity import to be optional, or you want to have two overloads.
It's much more likely that a client will want to override just on-activity import than the reverse, by far.
Does the compiler give you a warning when in this case, or does it just silently bind to the other ones?
I think it just silently binds to the existing one.
Yeah.
So in this case, actually making them both optional adds value because you can just use the colon syntax to decide which one you want to pass in.
It seems fun.
Yeah, in that case.
So just leave it the way it is?
Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
The only other thing I had is maybe we should rename payload obj to payload object. But
okay.
Or payload.
Just payload, yeah.
Actually, I like that, yeah.
Just payload.
Really type qualifier as object.
You could also go with state because that's what we use pretty much everywhere else, but I don't care that much.
We use payload, just that one word, in like event source APIs, right?
I don't remember.
If it's semantically equivalent to state and we don't already have a precedence on this type of using payload, then it's like the general a thing that gets passed and you can look at it if you think you understand how to.
So imagine the behaviors. If you don't understand the payload, you should just ignore it, right?
The payload object?
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
Well, it's yours, right? Like you. Just get
In
it back.
fact, it is a fairly likely situation in which all you wanted to do was fiddle with the activity.
Okay.
Like we've already got, we put the payload object there because some things will have been transferred to the activity by us, and if that's enough to do what you needed to do, and in particular, recording is likely to be that. We've already transferred the recording bits, so then all you have to do is like decide to turn it on or decide to turn it off. So you didn't even care about the payload object.
Yeah.
But if you did care, obviously you have to know that this particular site passes a blah kind of object, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And
is enabled, I imagine, is called very, very, very frequently once we subscribe.
it's the most frequently called API.
So there is another work item that we should probably open up as a result of this, which is the ability to proactively JIT a delegate. I know we have it on dynamic method, but right now what will happen is if you create a delegate to an isEnabled function and it hasn't been JITted yet, the delegate will always, always, always point to the pre-stub, even after the method's been JITted, which means you have several indirections before the method even gets invoked, always, for the remainder of the application. If we had the ability to pre-JIT a delegate, we could make that better. I mean, it's not necessary for this, obviously. It's just something we could do to make this even better.
Right. But that can be done whenever that feature comes online.
I just wanted to voice it. So
I love perf. That sounds fine. So just so I remember, so I heard we wanted to change payload object to payload, recording to recorded, and I think we decided to not do anything else. Is that right?
That seems right.
Okay.
I just added the notes to the.
Okay, great.
I commented on it as well. Anybody else did anything else? Otherwise, I'll just approve it as proposed. Nobody else seems to object. So
okay, great. Thank you.
That was.
Yeah, I mean, the only other question is it's called W3C ID, so it's capital number, capital.
Yeah. W3C is a proper name.
Slide it back up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I have. It looks weird because it looks like a big long string of caps.
No, I agree.
Yeah, I was seeing the same thing earlier. Like especially like this, it's unclear whether it's CID or CLD, which is the other problem. But
I think it would look more weird if you lowercase the c, though.
Though actually, I mean, what they call it here is trace flags. So, I mean,
yeah,
W3C trace flags at least gets rid of the CI.
So I don't have a problem with putting trace in there. We kind of did that with the other case. We had activity trace ID and activity span ID.
So I mean, if this is just saying that it is representing the trace flags value of the trace context, whatever W3C calls their specs these days, recommendation, then calling it W3C trace flags seems fine. And And our proper name qualifier only applies to ours. It's the pack forming of why that was case.
Is there any need to actually include W3C, or could we just call activity trace flags?
So they don't. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? Your question?
So is there any value in actually having the W3C prefix, or could we just call it activity trace flags?
You could.
I mean, at least that tells you what it's for, right? The other one is you can't activate the spec
The docs can say that it's aligned to the
Yeah.
W3C recommendation, but we don't need to embed that in the name unless it's to disambiguate it with another similarly named enum.
No, there's no other Nino. But I'm okay with that. I don't care.
Because it also avoids the.
So I'm sorry. What was the final name then?
I just suggested activity trace flags. Anyone else has a better idea?
Activity trace.
One thumbs up.
And the trace flags is what they called it in the spec.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they call it trace hyphen flags aside from
That's
when they call
fine.
it trace no hyphen flags.
Yeah, that's
But,
fine.
It's a W3C spec.
That's cool.
Right, and I think that was it.
I guess technically it's currently a W3C working draft.
Yeah.
So if we're lucky, they change it before we ship,
Where it always is.
or after we ship. That's maybe lucky.
It has been fairly stable, hasn't it?
Wait until someone ships, and then you do an editorial revision and change all your nouns. And
Well,
then Windows
renames we're not gonna.
Okay.
All right, so then we can remove this guy because now we have it. All right, so then I would go with this one, or should we go with something else first?
Oh yes, this one.
Yeah.
So do you want to give us an overview of what this is?
Yeah. So basically, this is a proposal to extend the existing event counter class. So that's already existing API that you can use to track events that are very frequently happening. Like it's supposed to be used for counting purposes. But
Just remind me, we already shipped this in 2.1 and 2.2, or this is new in
Yes.
2 and 3?
No,
this is already shipped into.
Okay.
Also in.
it's actually older than 2.1. It goes back. I've forgotten exactly when, and, at least to 2.0. And
I still remember designing that.
Yeah.
And it's been years ago.
It's been a long time.
So it shipped in 4.7.1 apparently.
Yeah, it shipped on the desktop.
Netcore 1.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Even
this,
Wow.
so the proposal is to add 3 new classes that are similar to event counter, but behave slightly differently because event counter may not behave not so well for certain kinds of counters or metrics. And also extending event counter, the current event counter API to add 2 new public surfaces. So the property display name is there so that you can add event counters, like literally like a name for displaying purposes. So as of now, you can create an event counter with a name, but let's say you want to display it in some kind of like dumb viewer that wants to like be used on a CLI setting, and if you want to enable it with the name that it was provided with, but want to display with like the nice like with spaces and things like that, then may not work very nicely in like a CLI setting. So that property was added there so that it can be set if needed.
So do we expect this to be exposed as a command line option or just for display purposes?
Just for display.
Okay. So we don't expect people to have a command line switch that matches that or anything like that?
We don't have control technically over what they do, but we expect them to use the programming name of the event or the counter is more convenient for things like that because you don't have to quote it and things like that. So
well, it's also
that's
like
what
if you
we-
say display name, it kind of implies to me that it might be localized or other things, and we may actually change it too. Like
So
whatever,
the
right?
question of localization is interesting. We didn't address that.
The only reason I'm asking is because if you call something display name and then you say it's used in the context of the CLI, then what I'm hearing is that you end up with scripts that refer to them, right? In which case it's no longer a display name, but it's actually like a programmatic name. But if you don't expect that to be the case, then I think the name display name is fine.
Okay, that's
It's more like a fragility thing. If you say display name, I would assume you can change that as well. Versus if it's referred in the script, then you wouldn't be able to, because you would break people.
And the next one was metadata. So this is mainly because, so you mentioned localization, maybe that's something that you can add with metadata. So it's basically an arbitrary key value pair that can be added optionally again, and that gets reported with the payload of the event counter. So let's say like someone wants to mark their counter as like being important or something like that. Then,
or the units of
right, or the units
or
of
preferred units, anything where anything that the site, the instrumentation site knows that would be useful for the viewer to know.
Right.
You can pipe through this. That's the idea. And we've already had several instances of this kind of data that would be handy. Formatting, if I prefer the number to be in hex or something, I don't know.
We already captured that we have an explicit rule metadata is equal.
Yeah.
Okay. One word.
Yeah.
Yep. It's in a table of words that are commonly misspelled in the framework.
Okay. And then there's a new class called polling counter, which is a variation of the event counter API, but this is this gets created with a delegate that it can use to get the metrics out of instead of explicitly having to call write on it. So
yeah, so the original event counter was designed for a particular kind of instrumentation case, which is I have a lot of things that are firing many times, a lot. So every time a request comes in, you want to be able to just say to the event counter, okay, log that, but don't actually like send an event. That's too expensive. So that's what it does. And so it's expecting write. Every time that thing changes, you tell me that something, that the counter has changed. It turns out that in many of the cases, we have a different thing. For whatever reason, someone has already got a number. It goes up and down. It's the amount of memory in the process. It's the working set. It's something else. Somebody else has done that for me. And so I don't actually have something that says write, or well, I'm changing. And so we want to plug into those kind of scenarios, and that's what this is for. Originally, we tried to glom it onto event counter itself, just have one class that did it all, and we decided that it was starting to become more confusing. Like it was the Swiss Army knife that had so many devices in it that you don't know what it's for anymore. And so we decided to break them up. And so this is one of the chunks.
Is the notion with metadata that if you use the same key, the last writer wins? As in, is it using dictionary semantics?
Yeah.
Because if not, we should
Yeah.
not call it key.
We should probably also call it set at that point because add kind of implies it's additive.
okay.
Versus set just basically tells you the last one wins.
Yeah.
So you scroll down a little.
You can see that it doesn't, it has a very impoverished API. You just basically give it this function that it will call when it wants to poll, when the client wants a second or whatever it told it to do. It will call this function and then it will ask whatever thing was already accumulating that piece of data to give it back to it. And so it really, this polling counter doesn't do much except link the two things together.
There's the notion of the poll interval, etc.
That can be set by the listener.
Yeah.
Whoever is listening to this and set that interval, and then that'll report exactly once per interval.
So event counter already has this notion that the controller of the counter on the other end can give it commands, and in particular decide what the polling interval is, or I want a poll now, please give it to me now. This is sort of what you need on the instrumentation side. I'm at an instrumentation site, what do I need to do? And pretty much I just need to provide the delegate callback.
So how was it solved before this class?
We didn't do it. We never had those kind of event counters.
And then I feel like Christoph usually suggests that things that come in through a constructor, it's nice to have a get property to give it back. Maybe not necessarily on the delegate, but
Which one are you talking about, display name? Or? No.
the counter name, maybe the event source.
I believe-
since they seem to be linked.
Do we have a property already for name? I thought we might. We forget her.
Yeah, I assume that.
I'd be surprised if we didn't have.
Polling counter is an entirely new class proposal.
Is
Oh,
the
good point. Good point.
but it
Good
inherits? Does it inherit from event counter?
No, you can see
Oh.
that it doesn't, which is
Oh.
why he's
Well,
got
it's a
very
question
good
what's
point.
omission, what's by design, right?
Logically, they're all counters, but there's sort of nothing API-ish that sort of really, binds them together.
Well, you could
Event
imagine
counter-
like the name, right?
Event counter currently does not have
A
either
name.
the event source or the string name exposed. It just has write metric and dispose.
Can technically get the name by doing toString on it. But
Anyway, I think it's fine to have a name property.
But should we introduce an abstract base
Okay.
that basically just has
Um,
display name and name on it?
So,
So
we talked about this. I don't know what
the
the.
implementation detail for this, I actually have it implemented already. So event counter, polling counter, and the rest of the counters in this thing inherits a base class, an abstract base class, and that has display name as a property.
Yeah, I think that might
So-
make also. As implementation, I think it's easier for customers if they have a hierarchy where you have related things grouped together. Because in
Yeah.
docs they show you, if you're on the
Right.
abstract, you see the derived types.
Right.
Okay.
And I think it makes it a little bit easier, especially like things like, oh, we should always have a display name, we should always have a name, where you just prescribe it on the base and say these are abstract, you better have them, and then how you pass them in.
Nominations for the name.
Diagnostic
Hey,
counter,
you
I don't
guys,
know.
you suggested it.
I don't know, how did you call the base stuff?
Just base counter.
Base counter? Yeah, well, I will probably go with something like
Counter.
diagnostic counter or something because we don't usually use base.
Diagnostic counter. Okay. I noticed that event counter is disposable, or at least became disposable in 2.1. So presumably the space should be disposable, and then all these will
Yeah.
because a base class hierarchy is part of the public API,
Yeah.
unless we rely on the ref compared to the implementation. I don't know what the universe does when we do that. So the base class hierarchy should have been in that. Included in the
It's also worth calling out that metadata should be lowercase d.
Yeah.
We already got
Yeah.
that.
Okay, I missed that.
That was the I went and looked at the table because I thought that was a.
Yeah, it's one of the
One that we
common
Already.
ones.
And I assume that the display name is actually getter and setter, not.
Yeah, that was
Not
up
field.
above.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, just get the ducks in.
You're right, though. Looks like a field.
Let me just edit this inline here so we actually what we're talking about.
Yeah, we should.
Fuck me, I just made Alright. Public class, public. And it's get set or just
Who's
get
that
set?
sentence?
And I assume the reason that it's post-construction settable is localization or any other renames that anybody feels like doing if they can actually get a hold of the thing.
Mostly we don't care. You know what I
Again,
mean?
just-
Like, it's just a variable that we send out the pipe.
Yeah, just
So if you want to
asking
change
if
it,
it's- if it
we
should
don't
be
care.
constructor and then get only, or
if there was an invariant that we were trying to preserve, then it makes more sense to sort of say, hey, you said it once and then we'll validate it.
Why float being returned from get metric function rather than double?
it looks like it's what the event counter takes as its metric.
Yeah,
Okay.
we were kind of following suit there.
Yeah. I was just wondering, since classically most of the APIs in .NET have taken double. So,
Yeah.
I really don't like the name get metric function, but I'm having trouble coming up with
Better, yeah.
get metric.
Get
Metric provider. Okay.
Could just be get metric or get value.
yeah, I would have said get value isn't too bad.
What do we call it on lazy?
I agree.
Or just
It's called value factor, isn't
Metric
it?
function kind of sounds like it returns a function.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, I think lazy is called value factory or
Yeah,
something.
but yeah. So
But
lazy.
it's an actual factory.
That's true. I'm just trying to think of things where we take. I'm trying to think of an API like this one of a. I want to call this a bunch instead of I'm going to call it once.
I mean, that's pretty much what all the methods on Link are, and they're either called func or selector or random things like that.
So wait, Steven, do you have a suggestion? It was get value?
I was thinking get value seems
I
pretty
don't have a
straightforward.
problem with get value. I don't know.
Seems new to me.
Or someone just takes 5 minutes and does a sampling across the framework and see what we already use, and if anything matches closely, we use that.
Right.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing that Steven just brought up. I think most of the time we try to avoid it.
Try to avoid what?
Like we usually have a very specific name, like selector or predicate.
I see.
Um,
So
Handler.
get value is too generic, is what you're saying.
no, I'm just saying like we usually don't have that problem because we
Metric
usually
Oh, I
provider.
see. Get
Manager.
metric is also
No,
fine.
provider. It provides you metrics.
You are getting the metric, so get metric's also fine. Just drop the function. Because after all, the function.
Comes from function. Yeah, it's a function.
honestly you could just call it metric at that point, right? Like,
Yeah, I'd like get metric because if you said metric to me, it would be the value.
Right.
If you say get metric, it's the verb and therefore the function that gets the value.
So why doesn't it take
measure.
any arguments? Because you're just supposed to like provide whatever. The
That's right.
is.
You're just saying what is the value now, and so it returns. You know.
Would it be silly for it to be called poll?
I'd prefer something like poll metric, but poll
What about
polar
yeah, polar? That's the same thing I was just thinking.
polar spelled appropriately with an ER, not an AR.
Oh.
Poll.
ESL here.
Poll metric to me seems to work well with the name of the type.
Poll metric I could live with. Actually, poll metric's pretty reasonable.
Yep. Makes sense.
Any last? Anyone care?
I'm just trying to see if I can find anything else taking a function this way.
On the existing event counter, do we have anything related to this? Like, are there any things called metrics, or are there anything called get or poll or any such things?
We have a write function.
It's called write metric.
Write metric, yeah.
Wait,
So
did you mean on
having
event
metric in the
source or
name is-
event counter?
I actually meant event counter.
Okay.
Having metric in the name would probably be good. So poll metric is reasonable.
Yeah, if the existing one is called write metric, poll metric seems.
Actually, given that this is called the polling counter, I think actually it's pretty good. Going once, going twice, poll metric.
Great.
Let's
That was
move
easy.
on.
And then there's the usage. Yep. That all makes sense to me.
Sorry, I may have missed it earlier. Did you say that we're planning to add a base class to all of these?
Yep.
And that add metadata is moving down to the base?
Yeah.
Oh, with
Okay.
metadata as well. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Actually.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, you should.
So let me say abstract.
Yeah, does it make sense for since the event, I mentioned the name, does it make sense for the event counter to have a get exposing the event source off of it? Again, this is sort of mostly me echoing.
We'll get on the get name.
Well, did we just,
Yeah.
usually if something is given as a
Yeah.
constructor parameter, we have
Yeah.
a get only property
Yeah.
that returns
So
it back.
event
so we
source
can
and name?
track it.
Does it make sense?
It makes sense. I could even imagine it being useful. Like,
So on the base class, we would make name and event source be get only properties,
I don't have a problem with that.
and then it would get the add metadata and the display name as the get set.
And do you want, in that case, on the polling counter as well, the poll metric? Does it make sense?
No,
That one, I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, probably not.
That one starts feeling weirder. 'Cause now we're giving back a delegate.
yeah. Would you ever?
I'm asking for,
Indeed.
The other one has value in the sense that you might want to send events to the same place you were sending the counters to, and so knowing what that was after the fact. Otherwise, you would have to somehow get a contract with whoever created it to sort of give it to you as well.
So they all take an event source, right?
Yes.
So then it should be on the base as well. Then.
Yes.
How frequently does the increment counter happen for float increment equals 1?
I haven't talked about that one yet.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I can talk about the incrementing one if no one has any other.
I'm mostly interested in how frequently it happens because after 16 million increments, you're going to start incrementing by 2 or 0 if you are trying to increment by 1, based on how floating points work.
Not necessarily. So the fact that the float is coming in as a float doesn't mean our increment is a float. If our increment was a float, what you're saying is true.
Well, if it's an integer, if the base value is a float and you're incrementing it by an integer or float or anything by 1.
Right.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is we still have control. It could be a double internally. The accumulating value could be a double.
Yeah.
Which would avoid what you described.
Yeah,
but
up till 2 to the power 52.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. That's a pretty big number.
You gotta restart your process after that.
Yeah.
So my question is, like, after you created such a counter, like, what do you do with that? Like, how do I get?
So all of these, it's about there's some subscriber on the other end that we've already got that plumbing piped because that came in with the original event counter. And so this is about different instrumentation scenarios. So the back end still looks the same, which is that somebody subscribes either through ETW or an event listener and says, I would like to get the information out of these things, and says, I would like to get this information every 10 seconds or whatever, or I'd like the information right now. And then the counter gives you back a payload that it actually keeps statistics. It keeps the min and the max and the average. And
so is the expectation in my app, if I want to provide the GC heap size thing, I just new it up and store it somewhere so it doesn't get dropped by the GC? Is that it, or do I?
So, I mean, you can do this for internal telemetry, but my expectation actually is that often for internal telemetry, you don't even want to bother with the counters because every counter got its information from someplace, and often you can just go to that place and get it. So, for example, if you wanted to know the process working set, you would ask for, you call the API that does that, and that would be easier and simpler than sort of creating an event listener that listens to this and then pluck it out and like decode it and blah blah blah. But if you're actually going out of process, that's where this starts to add value, and the scenario sort of makes more sense. But you can do that if you wanted to.
No, I guess my question is, like, presumably the idea is that by me newing this thing up, I somehow allow external entities to get this data somehow.
That's right.
So my question is, like, if I'm an application author, what do I have to do to make that happen? Do I just move this thing up and just stick it somewhere, or do I, like? My question is basically like who does this line here?
That's the instrumentation. Yeah. So.
And where does this polling counter go? Like, I mean, presumably you have to hold on to that or something.
So the pattern that we established is that all of these counters are fields in some event source. So if you imagine that you are the library author or whoever who decides to create an event source because you want to provide telemetry to somebody,
I see.
And then you decide that you want to have a particular counter, the pattern that we set is you just declare a field of this type in your event source and you new up one of these objects. And for the case of polling counter, that's it. You new it up with this delegate and you're done. It will call the delegate when it needs to, get the value, push it out on the pipe.
So the most common argument here would be this then, I suppose, right? Because you're basically holding on to that yourself, I suppose.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, that makes sense then. Then I think there was a question on the polling interval. Like, this is not customizable. Is that the idea?
It's customizable by the telemetry client. The guy who wants to receive it gets to tell you how often he wants it.
Right.
But that communication is happening via an ETW, a back channel like ETW. It's not occurring via a C# API.
Makes sense.
So this incrementing event counter, can I assume? I mean, it's very similar to event counter. It's just that the meaning of what gets done with the data is different. And initially, we sort of said, well, you could do that with metadata or other things. And then effectively, we decided that it was a big enough difference that it was worth having a different name, and forcing someone to understand that this is a different kind of implementation scenario than the other one. So effectively, there are counters that accumulate over time, and what you usually want under those circumstances is you want to create rates. You want to say, I have exceptions, and I would like exceptions per minute or exceptions per hour. But the idea is that I don't really want exceptions because that's an ever-increasing number. Or you have something like total working set. That's a number, and it doesn't always increase monotonically forever. And those are two different scenarios, and we should highlight the fact that those are sort of different. What they actually do is in the plumbing is actually very, very similar.
Yeah, it's just the way we calculate the statistics that we report changes because it's an increment counter.
We think it'll actually make it easier for people to do the right thing. Overloading this on the same class was causing, or would cause.
Timescale makes sense to be adjustable after it's created, or does that make more sense?
I'm sorry, what?
The timescale. Like, would you change it from exceptions per minute to exceptions per hour after you've created the counter, or is that a construction?
This is sort of a default that gets piped through as metadata to the viewer. And so you kind of don't expect it to change over time. You expect it to, it's an attribute of the data metric. Like when I'm doing exceptions, how many, do I want it per minute or per hour? And it's sort of a guess by the guy who's instrumenting the site that, I would rather have this probably per minute than per second. But it's a guess, and it can be overridden by the client, and this is just lets the viewer do a better job of guessing.
But in terms of its mutability, I mean, I would think of it similar to display name, where the overwhelmingly common scenario would be you set it once initially and never touch it again.
Yeah, right. That's what we expect.
And should every counter set it? So should it be a constructor parameter as well as a settable property? Like, would anyone create one of these and never set it?
Yeah, yes, you can do that. It just means there's no good default, and so the viewer has to guess without any hints. So if you have a hint of what a good interval is, then please provide it. You cannot provide it, and that's why it's not a constructor parameter.
So I feel like with Windows perf counters, I was trying to find how they work. With a rate counter, you always get a base counter, which was the step, and then the value counter, which is different. You need both here, or is something supposed to track the timeline elsewhere? Because I feel that Windows had this notion of like you had one that you bumped by one that it used as a step function of like, oh, I need to go recalculate the rate from how long.
Yeah,
I'm doing
I
it.
know that Windows had those two counter things, and I'll tell you that the complexity of Windows perf counters was sort of something we were trying to avoid here.
Well, so I'm just asking, is this managed internally? If you're trying to make a rate counter, because you mentioned rate counter, and the timescales seems to be for rate counters, and I'm just wondering if this is solving its problem, or if there's another thing later for helping solve that problem.
I can't give you an authoritative. Noah, do you want to say anything, or
What?
So the simple answer to the question is I don't. I would need to you know, do a better comparison between the two. We're to be able to answer your question. I can't get it to you off the top of my head.
I mean, certainly, I think we can.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
My concern would be if we're adding stuff here for helping do rate counters, but we haven't proven that it works for rate counters, we may be adding API that's not the right API for this, and that. That's all.
So I do think we can say that we are adding these in part because we are using them right now in the runtime. So we do sort of have our own examples that will validate that it works.
You could argue that we're missing a scenario, like there's a more advanced scenario that we're not covering, but that comes back to my point, which is that I felt like Windows counters were trying to do too much, and you know what you want is you want at least the simple cases to be handled simply.
Okay. If you think that this adequately handles exceptions per unit of time,
yes.
Yeah,
that's really my question. Is
we certainly think so, and if our own work were to discover that's not the case, which seems unlikely at this point, but if it did, then we would know quite soon.
Okay, that was all.
All right. There's one more API here, incrementing polling counter, which is sort of the same thing, but it pulls the value instead of you having to call increment yourself on the instrumentation side. So, yeah.
So it polls, but it also isn't a number that is bounded. It's a number that monotonically increases. So effectively, there is a grid here. You know, does the value monotonically increase, and really what you want are rates, or is it a value that sort of hovers and you know moves up and down on its own and stays in bounds naturally? That's the incrementing versus non-incrementing. And then the polling or not polling is whether does something have to accumulate all this number to get the value, or does something else already done that, and all you need to do is grab the number from somewhere?
I was about to say, so basically the idea is that this thing will call the get function value, take the result, and add it to what's already there, right?
Yeah.
Should we call it accumulating polling counter? Because that seems like a bit more.
We had that. So I've forgotten our.
We did discuss accumulating. The concern was that accumulating is a slightly more generic term, which arguably all of these things do, as in all of them. You have data that's coming in little packets, and you're accumulating it and summarizing it and then sending out a summary. So incrementing sounded more specific, as in it is a number that increases.
Yes.
Fair enough.
I mean, like incrementing on the previous one made sense because you had a method called increment that defaulted to 1, which is the thing that one usually increments by.
Yes.
This one, assuming, based on the previous name, I assume that you pull this function, you add it to your accumulator. The function, ideally, if you called it immediately again, should return 0. And it can sensibly return negative, maybe. And so that this isn't an increment because there's never a notion of 1 as the expected step.
So I'm gonna have to run here in just a second, but actually, so the get count function, it's expected that that number it's returning you is some monotonically increasing number over time.
So we're actually.
So
Go ahead.
The get count function doesn't have to reset the counter that it retrieved for you. It's just, you know, there's some number of exceptions that's just forever increasing, and you call get count to ask what that current number is.
So, but if get count just returns what the actual answer is, then how's this different than a polling counter?
It's about how that number gets used, in the sense that you effectively want to undo the incrementation. So, you know, at the viewer, he doesn't want to see.
I'm gonna have to drop off. Bye, guys.
See ya. You don't want to see an ever monotonically increasing number, even though that's what's being returned by this function. You want it broken up into some interval, the display rate time scale, figure out what it was at the beginning of that, figure out what it was at the end, subtract the two, get that delta, create a rate, and display that number. Events per second.
What if you had another like kind of class instead of those two, had like something which takes a metric and something which takes two numbers and returns a number, which tell you like what operations you're doing in that?
Could you repeat that?
So like, basically, instead of creating incrementing, so like you assume that someone wants to add numbers,
right?
You create something which takes a function of two floats and returns the float as well.
Okay.
So instead of like have another
right.
argument, and then basically user can decide, okay, I want to add, so I'm gonna pass the function.
The goal of these four classes were a belief that by trying to make one thing that tries to do everything, you actually confuse people. That it's hard to do the right thing because they actually are different scenarios, and so what we preferred was each one smaller things that only did one scenario. Once you picked it, you know, it becomes very obvious what to do, and you don't have to sort of think too hard. That was the design sort of spot that we were in, and it sounds like that's moving away from that spot, if I interpret it properly. So that's why we didn't do it. It's not that it wouldn't work or so forth, but
I mean, it does sort of feel that what you want is a rate converter on either the value push counter or the polling counter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because like certainly looking at this, if I were trying to write one of these, I clearly assumed that the
right.
that gets
So clearly,
is supposed to provide the value to
the documentation of that constructor we left out because we want to keep it small. But clearly, we would document the fact that we sort of expect a monotonically increasing thing.
Ideally, the type name and the parameter name together mean
are
that
enough.
Documentation is
indeed
not needed.
So go for it. Tell me what the right thing to do is. So we're open to fiddling with it.
Yeah, because like,
and if you want to like think about it for a few hours and then come back, that's also okay. Like I don't want to put you on the spot. Like,
because I mean, like something like total value provider or something like indicates that it's supposed to give a total. It's responsible for giving the total.
Yeah.
And
so certainly renames are well within.
So I can gloss over the type name and say that you have an incrementing counter and you have a polling counter, and this is the incrementing polling counter, and it makes sense to anyone who uses it. And then I would call the metric, the one we had before for polling, I would call it metric provider, and I would call this one, total metric provider.
Total, yeah.
So then it says in the name what it provides is the total. You give me the answer.
Having total, certainly having total in that parameter, to me makes a lot of sense. Even having total in the, call you a total polling counter. I don't know. I have to think about that, but it's not insane. Like
but total value provider to me says it is a thing that provides a total value. Like I know how to write one of those. So
and the names of the class should be related to how an instrumentation site uses it. You know what I mean? So the fact that I need to provide a function that provides a total is how you use it. So that's
So I can accept incrementing as the word being used for rate. Maybe we want the word rate instead of the word incrementing, but
We talked about rate
Yeah, we
at
did
one
talk
point
about
too.
rate, incrementing polling.
So we've been down this road, but it was like a month or two ago,
Yeah.
so I don't remember it anymore. But
if both places that said incrementing right now said rate,
but-
if the intention is to provide a rate counter.
yeah,
then
we definitely talked about rate. The danger, I believe the reason, I think I'm remembering one thing, which is that the rate is related to how it gets displayed, and it's completely true. But we felt like the class name should reflect how it was collected. You know what I mean? Like, because that's what you care about when you're using these APIs, right? Ultimately, someone will display a rate, but you don't really care about that at this point. But these were all things where we went around for a while, and then ultimately we picked something because we ran out of time. You know what I mean? Like
So one option is you could call it sum to rate polling counter, right? Because that's really what it does. But it takes a sum and makes it a rate.
Yeah.
And then
These are all
I'm personally fine with incrementing polling counter. Like I said, the suggestion I would have is this, what's currently called get count function, I would call something like total value provider, and I would go back to the previous polling counter and I would call it metric provider or value provider or something. That way the two of them look like they were designed at the same time. And and then and now it gives a much better sense of how you would write this function.
So hold on, like you would call this guy what?
So I'd leave the class name alone because I don't have a better name.
Okay.
It feels a little weird.
certainly changing parameter names. Is
But the
completely
parameter name for the what's currently called func float get count function, I would call total value provider. And then I would go back.
What was the other one called? Yeah.
The other one we said poll metric.
Yeah, so I would call that one metric
Provider. I think
Or
metric
value
provider is
provider.
not bad.
Third for me.
And then we're using provider as this function is a
Yeah,
provider.
it's a provider.
and-
I think that's reasonable.
And then for me, I think it's
Works for me.
monotonic and 32-bit scares me, and
Yeah.
counter and float scares me.
because the noun describes
Or
what
counter
it is
and
a
double
provider.
scares me as well.
Yeah,
Because
well,
those are just
Yeah.
things that...
So in retrospect, had we not called the other thing event counter, we would have preferred that we called it if we were to do it over again, we wouldn't call it event counter. We'd call it metric or
Yeah.
we wouldn't have called it counter. We agree that counter is a bad name, but consistent. There's this
Right.
question now of okay, is this one completely named differently than the others and so forth? So we stuck everything as counter.
But then even if we say it's not counter, it's just a metric, then
Right.
I think I'd still like to see double rather than float, because when you start getting to monotonic and 32-bit values, there's no fixing it later.
I guess I don't care.
Otherwise, we're going to be,
But I just want to think if the only thing that might make me care is the only place we use it in the existing API was write took a float.
I mean, if your API is contracted as passing the float through to the source or whatever, these can still accomplish that by taking double as their
They
and
can.
then
state.
converting to the
They
nearest
can.
representable float.
Yeah, agreed.
So
That's why I don't care a whole lot.
Yeah, so we could say that what ultimately gets passed is the float, but using double allows for increased precision. by the accumulation state.
I don't care. So if you guys want it to be double, let's do that.
Yeah, I don't have much of an opinion.
I'm sorry, did you get both of your thing out?
Yeah, I think that covers both.
Okay.
Where do you want to use doubles everywhere or just?
Preferably in all the public surface area or anywhere where we are saying something is monotonic.
And you're concerned with round off error effectively.
Well, for the monotonic case, it's not just round off error, it's overflow.
Well,
as
that's what I meant, overflow.
Yeah, and double will help with round off error for the accumulation as well.
So your processes live long enough that you've witnessed two exceptions, in which case all bets are off.
Right.
Yeah, there is
You're
a
probably
practical
right by that point.
infinity going on here.
The wonderful state where a double plus one
Yes,
itself.
is the same. Yes. rounds up.
The other thing I generally don't like about doubles and floats is that half of all representable values are between -1 and +1. So you end up with most states being there, but most people don't like working with values that are normalized between 0 and 1. So
Levi, it looks like the YouTube player has a bug with Unicode.
Discrete mathematics, I prefer my
I just uses the male shrug emoji, and it renders as the woman shrug emoji followed by the sign for male. So I don't know what they're doing, but
That's correct.
that seems very weird.
It's not the female shrug emoji. It's the gender neutral shrug emoji.
That is funny. Whatever, man.
like someone wanted this to 0 with joiner.
Moving right along. Are we done, or?
I think we're done. We'll just go back to this page here and paste in the comments that I had. So that we scroll all the way to the bottom like this.
So you should like modify all of it, like, and update this so that it has all the modifications, and then send out another round saying, "This is what I'm doing." You know, I mean, here's what I think is now is, and then they can decide to chime in one more time if they feel like it wasn't, or they thought about it and they going, "Oh, I really hate it." You know,
It might be faster next.
well, I don't think we need to meet for that, right? This is just,
email.
we're gonna sort of say it, and then you guys now have the onus to sort of veto it if you feel it's wrong. We're moving ahead.
Asking for forgiveness, not for permission.
I'm not even sure forgiveness, man. We're moving ahead.
I like that.
You only ask for forgiveness if there's room for error. There's no room for error here. All right. So
you
then,
signed off, man.
So we have two APIs which are blocking partner.
so there
But I don't
is.
think we have the people in the room, but we can check it out.
So the copy to async one we might be able to look at, and then the other one was the one that
GC
Christoph
memory,
had.
memory info.
This one here, I think, was the.
Is that the one you're going to use to get memory info?
No, I think David found.
That was Ludovic actually.
So
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
See you
we
guys.
have this one done. Let's look at this one here. This Christoph is here. So.
We have actually Mariam as well online and Jeremy, so if they need some APIs, if you can.
Yeah.
Okay, so currently in SSLStream does not like allow any way of configuring the CipherSuites. Custom need that. So this. So there's like process essentially one which builds the CipherSuite policy of CipherSuite. And once you build it, you construct the CipherSuite policy object, then assign it to, since the object the user cannot modify because property methods, the public constructor, the user has to pass it around, and once you construct that, you can pass it to a server client that option. And the CipherSuite.
Sorry, I may be missing something. This builder thing seems unnecessarily complex. Why isn't this just a collection of CipherSuites on the authentication options?
The reason for that is there's a couple of reasons actually. So one reason is like implementation. So in example, OpenSSL currently does not let you set the explicit list of the CipherSuites, which means if we make the mutable object, it will have to be constructed every single time on every request. So that's one reason. And the other reason is in case if in the future we add some more options in here, like filtering and other things, it's still much easier to handle the mutable object. The object which.
So the policy is an opaque, immutable object.
Yeah.
So once you have a policy, No, a third-party developer cannot inspect the policy. Only we can internally.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Every reflections.
I mean, like, so I know that the reason for the building the policy is that Windows needs to turn the allow list into a deny list after intersecting it with the system. OpenSSL needs to turn the allow list into a string configurator. On Apple, it's actually conveniently just but if we're in the end resulting in a list of CipherSuites, it seems like the policy could allow the discoverability of that via an iRead-only list. And then I wonder if the builder should essentially just be list of like you should be able to seed it with a enumerable. You should be able to add stuff to it, and then when you're done, you call build. Right now, where it takes a list and you replace it whole hog feels abnormal to.
Yeah, I mean, I would have, I guess, I would have assumed that. So let me take a step back. So you're saying the reason we have this builder is because it's expensive to create the policy, and so we want to allow someone to create it once rather than creating it every time they create
platform, but yes, it may be expensive.
Yeah, it's moderately expensive, and anybody who's going to use this option is probably going to use one set of policy, and they're going to use it for their whole app. But then they'll use it for every SSLStream they would open.
But the most useful, the most like expected API pattern would be you would either have a constructor on CipherSuites policy that just takes an read-only list of CipherSuite, or it takes an enumerable and then you just call it a day. Yeah. Like, why would you construct another object to just basically get that one out? Yeah. That seems very...
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if it just took it as a constructor parameter and it returned the class, it should be sealed, probably. If it just returned the class, and then you could inspect it as a iList. Yeah, the builder would make sense if we were adding filtering to it, but until we have that, it probably doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so we just have public sealed class CipherSuites policy that has a constructor that takes an IEnumerable of TLS CipherSuite.
Yeah.
It seems like the...
Sounds reasonable. And then callers would be encouraged to hold it.
What is TLS CipherSuite in this review also, or is it already?
TLS CipherSuite. I mean, it's already approved. It's not.
Okay, great.
Is it recently approved or is it long existing?
Recently. So it's essentially YAML value for CipherSuite.
Oh yeah, I remember
yes,
that
okay.
one.
It's the thing with all the caps and underscores.
Got it.
Just sneak them in one by one.
On the one hand, I don't like them. On the other hand, there is
it matches the standard.
It matches the standard, and there's a place that if we remove the underscores, the value becomes ambiguous.
Is that the
Thank you, Ron Rivas.
boiling water and frog alternative or something?
So does that make sense to you, Christoph? Of public sealed class CipherSuite policy has a public constructor that takes IEnumerable CipherSuite.
Would you still be able to implement that in an efficient way? I know that you have to do something different for each platform that we're on.
Fine.
Okay.
Its internals would be how, basically.
Yeah.
There's a question. Can you get S-Channel to change the CipherSuite? We talked with them, right? And there are options, not exactly fitting what we need, but
in a future version of Windows.
In a future version of Windows.
Discussed matches. I mean, that's not 100% matches, but it's possible to.
Yeah.
I mean, we already kind of said we really don't want people using this API.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then the only other question would be, and it doesn't have to be done right now.
Editor browser never.
Well, a thing to consider is, are there any policies that make sense for us to publish as pre-published policies?
What might be an example? Like we turn off older versions of TLS, or
if there was any, I mean, I know that we have the SDL, but it's a point-in-time thing that's constantly evolving. If there was any spec ever that mentioned like these are the recommended CipherSuites as of January 2009, and you have like, you know, by 2009, I mean 2019, good God, I'm old. Then we could reference like this is this person's set of stuff. It's just a thing to consider. It possibly doesn't matter because again, we don't want anyone to use this API.
And we could always add them later.
We want them to set their system and then just use their system.
Yes.
Right, so then let me just scroll. Actually, no, I can't scroll there because it's actually pasted in here. So does this sound what I just said?
Params are enumerable?
If only.
And then, then the only other question back to the previous thing is, should we allow that to come back as an inspection? Would it be read-only list, an opaque enumerable that doesn't let you go back and modify it, etc. Because we took it as a
Oh, I mean like exposing.
Yeah. So adding an enumerable that lets you get back the cipher suite, and it can be written as this iterator state machine that loops over the things, so you're not allowed to modify.
What would you do with it?
Just inspect it.
Inspect it.
So
For what
say that
purpose?
you're implementing a third-party component that actually relies on this, because you're, instead of using HTTP client under the covers, you're inventing your own thing. Like, how would HTTP client be able to look at the CipherSuites policy?
If you get back the exception that says the cipher suite could not be negotiated, if you look at if you can get back the input state that went into it and be like, oh, because you only enabled things that have been disabled on every computer in the world for the last 10 years, then that would help you understand why.
What reference assembly is this in, by the way?
This
System.security?
System.net security.
System.net security. Where is HTTP client and other stuff?
After that.
Okay.
Sorry, so now I, based on that scenario, I'm not understanding what this caches and where. So this has to do something with the underlying implementations to transform this list into something else.
Yes.
If I was implementing my own thing instead of HTTP client that took one of these, who's doing what and when?
Well, if you're building your own thing that's replacing SSLStream, then you would use this enumerable to figure out how you're going to do that work.
Sure, but you're saying this thing would have already done it under the covers in a way that's not accessible to me?
Correct, because this is building itself so that it can work for SSLStream, because SSLStream is going to be, it'll have an opaque value that is the right answer for S-channel on Windows, it'll have an opaque value that's the right answer for OpenSSL on Linux, and it'll have a right answer, or opaque value that is the right answer for Apple's secure transport.
Right. So this is going to compute something that's expensive to compute, but unless I'm SSLStream, that's useless to me.
Well, because unless you're SSLStream, the value doesn't apply to you. If you're writing your own TLS stack, it didn't matter. If you're writing a replacement to HTTP client that's built on top of SSLStream, you still get to use the same pre-computed value. And otherwise, this is a moderately expensive one-time operation for your own library.
Right.
But don't replace don't replace our TLS provider.
Okay. I guess it just feels weird to me that we say don't replace our TLS provider. But if you want to replace our TLS provider, here's the way to do it.
No. My statement for this is after you've made a connection and it throws the exception of no cipher suite can be negotiated, you could log these were the 6 things I said I was allowed to try.
Yes.
So this is about logging. This is about investigating failure instead of doing anything on the success path.
Okay.
That's the only reason I think it has any value being exposed.
Sure.
Also, the good old, I passed an opaque value through a bunch of APIs, and I can't tell if somebody replaced it midstream. Did the one that I thought I passed in actually make it through? So.
No, that's a viable scenario.
But this should definitely not return the input list, because casting it back out and modifying it would have unpredictable results. So this should use yield return.
Well, it shouldn't.
Or a read-only list or something. Like, no one's ever going to call it, so it doesn't need to be efficient. It just needs to not return the underlying data.
Right.
Okay. This is a beautiful API. It's expensive for other people, and no one's going to use it anyway. So we want to expose it. But I get it.
Diagnostics.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually happy going up where we're adding it to the client and the server options and the 2 properties that take it, and putting editor browsable never on them. Like, I'm perfectly fine with that, because we really want literally no one to ever call this. This is an escape valve, so they stop yelling at us.
Okay, that's fine. Just it feels weird, but it's fine.
Oh yeah.
Well, but that makes it really, really a good candidate for system crypto, where everything else feels weird already. So like that's
no, your gut check is right, Steve. Like we don't like it either.
When this gets in, we need to put up the documentation right away, saying like never ever use it.
The editor browsable is basically.
Is it gonna be there?
Yeah, it's gonna be on the. I don't know if we should put it on the CipherSuite policy itself or just on the properties.
Wait, what is getting editor browsable never here?
That's my understanding was on the SSL authentication options. The property.
Okay.
You don't actually see it.
Why? Isn't this necessary if you want to configure that stuff?
It is, but like you're not supposed to do it.
Yeah,
It's like setting TLS version. Like we don't want anyone to do that unless they really, really, really have a good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, but setting it in a browsable seems like a really big stick. I mean, it makes it entirely undiscoverable even for people that know what they're doing.
That people who know what they're doing should first ask us.
Yeah, basically this is being implemented for very specific people who have very specific scenarios, and they remain in contact with the product team. For us to tell them, please don't do this, but if you really need to do it, here's how you do it.
And somebody.
Do we have are there any other cases in the framework where we hide something like that?
I don't think so yet.
Where we hide stuff that we're doing for a very small number of people?
Yeah, I think the answer is no.
Generally, we bury it in an undiscoverable namespace, but I don't think we tend to put editor browsable never on it.
Just that feels wrong to me. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen, because the problem with editor browsable is that if you are one of those people that have to use it, like you basically have to fight the tooling, which seems like not helping.
Well,
you have
we
fight
try
it
to.
once.
So here's the thing: we try to make it really not discoverable for people not to use it accidentally.
Right, but I think the question is like, it's still discoverable in docs, right? So people will just copy and paste source code; it will just work. Like, I mean, like the typical scenario where somebody goes on Stack Overflow and like, oh, X didn't work, well, copy and paste this code snippet, that will still work, right?
Well,
so
yeah,
like
if somebody posts it on Stack Overflow, yeah, we're screwed because people copy paste. Yeah,
and that's kind of the thing where I don't know, like maybe there's better options to that. I don't know what they are, but I think in general, like, documentation helps. Obsoleting APIs can help. There's various ways you can do it. I think hiding it is generally problematic because hiding doesn't give you any sort of information, right? It's just not there. It doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do.
Saying you're not supposed to use it. Not recommended to use it.
Yeah.
If only we actually shipped code analysis.
Yeah, there's. Yeah. Well, actually, I have it on my plan for 3.0.
Okay.
Still push on it.
We should talk
the
afterwards.
platform compat.
Yeah, we should talk because I just yesterday spent some time on that one as well.
Yeah.
So I think that.
But anyway, so coming back, like what we want to prevent really is from people accidentally, discovering that, and like just hitting dot on process.
Sorry, what is
stuff is, in my
doing
opinion, valid scenario. Like people do that, right?
They do, but
So-
I think,
Besides copy paste for a second. Okay, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
You're worried about someone doing SSL options, SSL server authentication options dot CipherSuites policy equals new CipherSuites policy with new list TLS CipherSuite dot some capital letters long name accidentally.
No, it's made. My paranoia is what was hinted at earlier about people just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow.
No, well, my paranoia is
But
more.
that's going to happen regardless of whether it's
Yeah.
editable browser
Yeah,
or
we
not.
cannot
Yeah.
prevent
Yeah,
from
yeah,
Stack
yeah.
Overflow, like
Yeah.
bad guidance or blog post or something like that. But I'm afraid exactly about what you, Steve, said, because people say like, oh, what else can I, I want to be fully in charge. What should I set? Like they not read documentation, they just like start doing dot, and they see, oh, CipherSuites. Oh, I know what kind of CipherSuites I want. I know what kind of TLS versions I want, and preventing setting that is useful.
okay, but I would say like let's be real. Like I mean, if I'm an ordinary developer and I read the term allowed CipherSuites, I'm not thinking, oh, that's an attractive setting I should fuck with, because I don't even know what it means. Like I mean, if it's something like
you will be amazed. People see like TLS setting, and it's like, oh, sure, of course, I want to be in charge of what TLS is.
It's not the developers doing that.
Yeah.
It's the IT shops pushing down bad guidance that their developers are forced to follow.
Yeah, but they're going to push that guidance regardless of whether it's editor browsable or not.
I think honestly, editor browser, the reason I'm not a fan is that it's the same guidelines. I think I told the story before, but like Office tried this at some point, right? Making Office more discoverable by de-emphasizing rarely used functions, right?
Yeah.
And as soon as you have to hide for things once, you go into the tools options and say, fuck this, always show me everything, which kind of defeats the point. And I think like this is the same here. Like, I mean, there's global options you can turn editor browsable off. As soon as you had to hunt for an API once, you would just turn it off globally, just defeating kind of the point. I think editor browsable only makes sense for things we just know humans will never ever call. It's only for infrastructure code like compilers or others to call, where the namespace thing for whatever reason doesn't work because it has to be a member on some type or whatever. But I think for the most part, like if there's a bad API, I would be much more in favor of what you just said, like an analyzer. Because if they copy and paste code, I want them to get a warning and say, you probably don't want to call this API, and here's why you shouldn't call this API.
Okay, so maybe we just say the ships with an analyzer then.
Like I think
I'm fine with
that
in addition to or in place of making it editor browsable never.
So I would so the reason I say like I think editor browsable is problematic is that if what you said earlier is true, right? There's some customer who actually talks to us and has to use it.
Yeah.
If they actually have to touch their code, it just becomes shitty, right? Because now they don't see the thing. They will talk to you again. It's like, what doesn't show up in IntelliSense? You're like, no, it's there. Just copy and paste the string. Trust me.
Hopefully they've touched a total of 3 lines of code throughout their entire project in order to hook this up, which means it's not a recurring cost for them. It's a one-time cost.
Sure. To me, it's more like about bad precedents in general. It's like, I don't think APIs that shouldn't be used or should be rarely used should be hidden. I think that's just.
I also think that we do not scale to every customer that might actually have a valid need for this.
What if we just obsolete it straight up then, when we introduce it?
I'd be okay with that, but what would the message be?
The message would be consult the guidance at this FW link.
Can we give you a phone number in the string?
Not my phone number.
I have the most phone numbers, so you can report that.
1-800 do not call.
I guess we could give them the switchboard.
Just do 8675309.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think yeah. So what's the concern? The concern is they just misconfigure their stuff and they accidentally make them less secure than they should be.
It's not that. It's
but it's also crypto agility basically. So after a couple of years, like the guidelines change and people stay with the old options.
Yeah, we want people to be on OS defaults.
Right.
For TLS, for CipherSuites. There's just extreme scenarios where like medical devices, whatnot, IoT, where they really want full control because they know better, they have VPNs on top of that and whatnot. These people can set that and they have to kind of review and maintain their code very carefully.
Yeah.
But it's kind of for the like security super aware people. That's what it is for.
You're signing yourself up for ongoing maintenance if you set this.
Right.
Like, it's not something you can just set and forget. You actually have to be willing to patch your application every few months.
So can we just put like some really scary language in the summary tag in the IntelliSense?
Something like if you use this API, you opt out of support.
And IntelliSense is actually populated by documentation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean
Yes.
whatever you put there. Like it just doesn't apply when you copy and paste code, right? Because you don't write it. But I think honestly,
But neither does editor browsable or obsolete. What I guess you get a warning, but
you would get a warning.
I'd rather do that via a real warning via an analyzer rather than obsolete, which I always think is weird when you're adding it to brand new APIs.
Yes, I agree with
And
that.
plus, obsolete is hard to then suppress and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I think obsolete has several drawbacks, but I think so. The reason I'm asking is so the question is really what are you protecting yourself from, right? Because if what Levi said is true, like somebody pushes down bad guidance, whatever warning we give people, they're like, yeah, I know I'm not supposed to, but I have warning, so they will just immediately turn it off. So like if you think you know what you're doing, whatever obstacle we put in your way, you're like, yeah, but I know better, you override it anyways, right? So the only thing you need to realistically protect yourself from is somebody thinking that they might have to do something. But I think honestly, like cryptic names or just hard to use APIs like this one here are plenty protection. Like you're not accidentally doing this because you think you're getting something you're not getting. I think this is most applicable for APIs that sound very attractive, but they really are backwards. So they really they basically don't do you any favors because they actually go backwards.
So what's the TLS API? TLS protocols? On one hand, like why would people set that? Right? People do.
Well, TLS makes more sense, right? Because TLS is one of those areas where everybody recently went through the exercise where servers stopped working because they had the wrong TLS version selected, right? This goes back
Well,
to...
no, they said it before that.
Oh, I said it before then? Yeah.
Exactly. That's the trouble, right? And that's why we have the troubles because servers don't work these days.
Yeah.
Well, plus long time ago we had wrong guidance, but in tiny detail, right?
Well, that's the other thing. If you publish bad guidance that told people to set it, then yes, you're screwing yourself, right? Like there's nothing you can do about that. At that point, you're better off obsoleting the API and say, yeah, I know we told you to do it, but it's really wrong to set it, and here's why, right? But I think this goes more to education, right? Like if you have a problem with guidance, educating people helps. If your problem is people doing the wrong thing because they think they're doing the right thing, I think there's nothing you can do. Like it's just at that point it's just game over.
What namespace is this in? System net security? It's not really discoverable namespace anyway, so people probably wouldn't be tempted to find this.
That's why I would say, like, honestly, it seems, as I said, any crypto API is usually hard enough to use that people are not accidentally probing around.
Perhaps it might be actually better to...
I agree. I think documentation is fine here, and it's easier to add something later after we beat it to death and figure out that we want to do something than to take something away.
So you are right that the crypto APIs are hard to use, which is why people literally just copy and paste the top answer from Stack Overflow, which is why there were crypto APIs that were being proposed for 3.0, like streaming GCM, that we literally killed because we couldn't figure out how to implement it safely without people just copying and pasting stuff from Stack Overflow. That was honestly the reason we killed it rather than putting it in the product. Because it would be so fundamentally dangerous for people to copy and paste without knowing what they're doing that we just said we can't ship this. It would be irresponsible of us.
So what would be the Stack Overflow question that somebody would ask that would point them to a code snippet that would set allowed CipherSuites?
That I don't know.
How do I set up SSL, whatnot, custom, that type of stuff?
How do I use this specific list of recommended CipherSuites?
How do I use TLS 1.2 or how do I enable SSL 3.0?
Yeah, it sounds like that should be a blog post then, and the answer should be don't. you rely on the OS defaults.
It might be actually better to have the documentation explicitly.
Like
so they have.
No, I'm actually somewhat serious. Like if you publish a blog post in the .NET blog and you have a good title, chances are it's the first hit.
Yeah.
Like basically, if you predict there will be get guidance on Stack Overflow, just make sure you have the good guidance out beforehand.
Yeah.
Because people are lazy. They just go to the first blog post, copy and paste whatever that said, and if that said, good news, nothing to do here.
And like Christoph was saying, Steve, this could be the same thing we did for like unsafe.unbox, just document this as a safe usage.
Yes.
Like.
Yeah, I'd be fine if the summary for this was, do not call in capital letters, like, unless you really know what you're doing.
Hint you don't.
So
and then
we actually do have boilerplate that stuff like this is intended. What is it? This supports the framework and is not intended to be used from customer code.
Oh, this is, right.
Yeah.
But this is borderline. We should explain like what other scenarios in there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so documentation and analyzer seems like the best combo.
Yeah.
That's what I heard from here.
Sure. Because analyzers we could also make granular so that you don't just like disable warnings.
Yeah, exactly. You can easily click and disable that thingy,
Where do we add analyzers, by the way?
In the package that contains the API.
Is it in Cortex?
Yes.
So we don't have the analyzers yet.
But that's what
we have a beta of Compat platform for last 2 years or something like that, and I hope that hopefully we will be able to ship it eventually. I said it last year as well, so I did a great result.
Okay.
Can we also review one very simple diagnostic process API? I have already angry person.
I have a couple I'd like to look at as well.
Is it future or is it 3.0? Because honestly, even if it's angry person, if it's not 3.0 blocking, we have plenty of 3.0 blocking. That person has to wait, period. We just have to communicate.
Yeah, we will review this.
Did we?
Yeah.
Who promised that? Did I promise that?
What? I didn't promise anything. I said like
Yes.
I basically I think I asked the same question that Carol asked. We can look at it, but like
What's the number?
it's always
Well, I think Jeremy said he
wait,
had an
exit,
issue he wanted to look
wait,
up.
exit.
Number.
Jeremy, how long is your
3, 4,
issue?
6, 8, 9.
It shouldn't be long. It's 8173. It's just one of the very old ones trying to get it out.
That's future. Nope, that's gotta wait.
Yeah, I've also got a hardware
What?
intrinsic one that we need
No,
to.
not future,
Carol
it's
wasn't talking to
3.0.
you, Jeremy.
Sorry.
Oh,
yep,
sorry, confused.
Sorry. I already said this is not a high fried.
Yeah.
Don't promise.
Are you not?
To keep telling people like, sorry, I have to get away.
It's a Microsoft or something.
Doesn't make a difference. Either they have a huge business case that they need to explain.
Actually,
or
Do they have a
like
time
that.
machine where
I
they
think
can go
have-
back
gave
and
me,
give
like,
us
some
more room?
kind of business case.
why is it not in the bug? You know, we cannot have things
Yeah,
on the
that's me.
side. So yeah, tough luck.
All right. So what is the? It seems like it already has a workaround anyway, so they can't be critical.
What are you looking at?
I was just looking at the thing that he was just saying. So, Jeremy, what was the one you wanted to look at?
8173. It's a pretty old one, so but this is a pain point that people have been asking us to fix, and it's relatively well, there's no way to fix it perfectly, but the whole thing where you want to leave the stream open when you create a StreamWriter or a StreamReader, it's a pain in the butt because we don't actually document what the default encoding is or the default buffer size.
So this is funny. So we just recently had the exact discussion on this type, like how does this actually work at all? Because the thing is, if you use a StreamWriter over a stream, and you call, well, I guess the writer might actually make more sense. But the problem with the reader, for example, was that it would buffer itself. I don't know whether the writer buffers, but basically, what you can get into these weird states where the reader already consumed more from the stream, so you cannot reliably use the stream afterwards because you have like read too much data already from it. I don't know whether it applies to the StreamWriter.
The stream.
Yeah, I mean, for StreamReader, the leaveOpen is useful for something like memory stream, where you're gonna rewind it, or you're reading from a file stream. You're gonna read it multiple times, so you wrap the StreamReader around it, you leave it open, and then after you've closed the reader, you say, I'm going to reset the position of my file stream. But you're right that you wouldn't say new StreamReader file stream, and then without changing the position on the file stream, try and read from it because it may have progressed past where you were.
Yeah. So positioning and whatever else. So this is about reutilizing the same stream with reader writer or resetting it or whatever. So it's just when you do want to use it, it's a pain in the butt because basically you end up looking at the source code and trying to replicate what encoding and buffer size are if you haven't set them. Unfortunately, our existing constructors don't make it easy to add an additional constructor because it would like butt heads with StreamReader, takes a true, etc. So like the recommendation is down at the bottom. After we've discussed this for a few years, this has been open for almost 3, but like down at the bottom, the simplest answer to let people do this is to basically expose our existing there's already an internal property for leaveOpen. The recommendation here is just to expose leaveOpen and add a getter, a setter to it as well. It's all the way down at the bottom. Right. So this doesn't work because it butts head the stream, and leaveOpen butts head StreamReader, which already has a stream and already has a stream bool constructor.
Wait, Jeremy, you're saying the actual proposal is down?
At the very bottom,
yeah. Emo, can you scroll down?
So I'm confused. What doesn't work? Like the first proposal here doesn't work?
That can't work because it conflicts with the existing constructor. It has the exact same signature.
Well, you would just add these default values to the existing constructor. You would not add a new one.
I don't know how you can do that while still being net standard compliant.
Yep. Well, StreamReader.
Because technically it's not an API breaking change to make things default.
It's a runtime breaking change because we would now be accepting -1 where previously we didn't.
Yep.
Which means that if you were compiling against a ref assembly that had the defaults, but you were going against an older runtime, you would get an exception in the constructor.
I see, because the implementation would have to change.
Yeah.
But that seems... reasonable because you would have to compile against the higher version to see the defaults to begin with. So you cannot retroactively make that work with net standard anyway. You would have to make these changes in like basically at the same time.
Yeah, they'd have to go at the same time.
Which still seems like we could do it. I mean, honestly, I would prefer that over anything else because that at least scales, right? So if you have to add a fourth argument, or you add a fourth overload, make everything default there, and remove the defaults from this one. And then you just have a sane way. Otherwise, it becomes this never-ending problem.
I don't want to add another overload at all.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, imagine we would have to expose a fourth option, right? The way we would do it, we would just add another overload, make everything default on that one, and then go back to this one, remove the defaults.
Well, didn't you, Steve, or Jeremy say that there actually was a fourth option at the bottom of the report?
Yes, that's that. The thing I'm recommending is down at the bottom after we like kind of beat this around, and it's we already have a leaveOpen property inside both of these in TextReader and TextWriter. It's just internal.
Right.
And I just want to make it public. And that seemed like the simplest, less griefy way to do it because the set of constructors between the two aren't the same. So the pattern would be the same in this case for both the StreamReader and the StreamWriter.
Right.
So you would do the normal constructor the way you do it now, and you just do leaveOpen equals whatever.
But I thought go for it.
I mean, there's other options that we want to be adding in the future that people have been asking for these things. You know, and I'd much rather like add an options. Flags don't really work because the buffer size and stuff like that. You know, but you know, doing something akin to the enumerator and adding a reader or reader writer options or something like that requires a lot more thought.
It has all downsides. I think the leaveOpen one seems reasonable to me as well. I don't think it will work for all cases for things that you want to have immutable, right? You want to set them only once effectively. I mean, I'm not opposed to the leaveOpen here, but like, I mean, take FileStream, right? It has the same problem. It's like 6 overloads. The most common one people want to set is async or is true async, which you probably can't change after you constructed it. So, like, in general, like, I would be in favor of saying, would we be okay with this change?
There was a link down here saying that I believe somebody was talking about that we generally weren't doing default arguments.
In constructors?
As a pattern.
We do in a few
No,
cases.
so the reason we haven't done them in the past is because we couldn't figure out how to make them serviceable. And then when we talked with the Roslyn team, we came up with a servicing pattern, or I shouldn't say servicing, came up with a pattern on how we can safely add more overloads without getting into states where it causes ambiguities. And the pattern is, as what I said earlier, is like if you have to add a fourth argument, what we would do is you create another overload. On the new one, we make everything default, and on the current one, we just remove the defaults. So that's not a binary breaking change. Everybody
you float them forward to the longer one.
Correct, and then you can always, like, source will compile, binaries will just work fine, and then you can always set any argument in any order, and things will just compose nicely. I think that's a better way to go about it, because otherwise, if you add a fourth one that we cannot, change after the constructor was run, then the property pattern doesn't work, right? And then you're back to square one.
Although in this case too, if like we ever decide to change the default size, that would be kind of awkward.
I would agree with that. On the other hand, though, like
because it's a const rather than a static.
So that's what I would say. You would generally say what you do here. You just have a magic marker, like -1, and say if it's -1, you pick some number, right? It's not ideal, but it's still.
Why not expose the constant, the magic constant, as default?
Because we might change it.
Because you can't change it easily.
Have you changed in the past? How long has this?
We have. I mean, we have changed internal buffer sizes of streams based on perf benchmarks. I mean, you're right. You can break people with that if they happen to rely on the exact things. But we have even done it in full framework. I mean, we changed the internal buffers for, I want to say, FileStream from like, I want to say 1K to 4K or something based on some benchmark.
Yeah, and in the future, as computers get more performant, we'll probably decide to change it again to something.
But the reason I asked, I think it's still as if we expose it.
Yeah.
Rather than having it.
I mean, if you really don't want to change it, I mean, then that's fine. But I think in general, like the sentinel value is not ideal, but I think for buffer sizes it's okay. It's more problematic usually where null also has a meaning. It's like what? I cannot give you -1 there, right? Like that's.
Do we allow people passing in 0 for this API?
Today, we probably don't. Maybe. I mean, it would just mean no buffering, right?
Yeah, I could see 0 being no buffer.
Okay.
Although I think most of our APIs
If only I could find my mouse.
interpret 0 as default.
Some of them, yeah.
Like if you pass a capacity of 0 to a list, it does default. We don't treat, and I think negative isn't allowed at all.
Correct. Negatives allowed for things like timespan.infinite, for instance. It's sometimes a surrogate for that.
Yeah.
If we do add the default values to this, it would also solve other people's annoyance issues. If you want to just set the buffer size, you have to set the encoding, which is
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I think most of them are kind of reasonable because you probably change your encoding more frequently than your buffer size, right? So it's not leaveOpen.
Sure, but like, that's not always true. And
yeah, right.
Clearly, the further you get into this list of arguments, the more of a pain in the butt it is for that narrow set of people.
Also, today we don't accept 0 buffer size. This argument will arrange for that.
Maybe we should just make the default 0 then.
I think -1's a saner default, just because you can't conceivably have -1 for the buffer size, but you could say 0 means no buffering.
Yeah, sure. I could buy that.
Yeah, what do people think about this one? Should we go with the default, or should we just do a target fix?
If we can do this, it's better assuming that we don't inadvertently break people who might be, relying on the existing behavior, whether intentionally or unintentionally.
You mean the existing behavior of the buffer size?
No. So two things. First, if maybe there's a scenario where people are passing an actual encoding value into the constructor here, and if they pass in null, they actually want an argument exception because it's like, oh, like clearly I have a bug in my own code. Alternatively, what I mentioned earlier about for whatever reason you're on a new reference assembly but on an old runtime, and now you get weird exceptions.
I thought
that you didn't expect.
I thought for encoding we already accepted null, and we interpreted that as UTF-8. Because that's what the default overload that just takes.
No, this one flows for encoding null.
Yeah, I don't think it's common. I hope no one's depending on it. I'm just wondering if that's the case.
In the reader, it requires.
I see.
I mean, though, to be fair, look, I don't care about that scenario where somebody has the higher reference assembly runs down level, because that means you manage to compile against the later runtime and run on an older. That's always unsupported.
So
you can have arbitrary errors in that base.
Yeah.
Like missing method, missing type, right? Like everything is undefined.
Yeah, so then the only, and this is a weak argument, like, does the API surface as it currently exists allow people to find things that would otherwise be bugs in their code because it does parameter checking?
Right.
Where if we switch this to a default, now it does the incorrect thing at runtime.
That is the downside. On the other hand, though, I mean, we're generally okay with weakening preconditions, right? That would be an example of that.
Yeah, and I'm looking at other things that we have, like dictionary takes a comparer in its constructor as a parameter, and we allow passing null there.
Yeah, and so, I think the most common is probably toString, because iFormat provider, if it's null, we just say get the current culture.
Sure.
So why not expose the default coding rather than having null? I get the buffer size, we don't want to do it, but go change it.
Because you can't have non-null.
Oh.
They have to be literals, otherwise.
Yes.
It's encoding UTF-8 no bomb. So yeah.
Should run enum, then yes.
Yes.
Steven, what are your thoughts? Or are you past the point of carry?
I'm kind of past the point of carry. I don't know, it seems pretty unlikely to be using a new ref assembly that contains this and an old runtime.
Yeah, I'm willing to say we shouldn't worry about that, just as you all had said.
So
At which point, if we could do with the existing constructors, that seems fine. I'd be fine having a leaveOpen property as well. It doesn't seem problematic. It even has some advantages. So I don't have a strong opinion.
The concern with leaveOpen is I only solve the property is I only solve the leaveOpen problem, not buffer size or encoding.
Yep. Or detect encoding from byte order marks, which isn't listed here.
Right.
No, and that's
So we
a
would-
good point. Yeah.
Although it would be nice to know, I suppose, if it was left open. If you were getting this thing passed around, is it going to be closed? Whatever, I don't know. I guess that's pretty rare. Never mind. So go ahead and add defaults to the largest constructor then for both of those.
I think validating along the way that it doesn't change any possible call to use a different overload than it otherwise would have.
Because that can happen from ordering changes.
Sorry, what was that?
How
I'm not sure-
would we
I'm not
break
sure.
those by adding the defaults?
I don't know that it could happen. I'm just wondering if there's any possible way it could, and if it could, we should avoid it, but
Well,
it probably can't.
I don't think it's a case of we should avoid it. It's we should, if we could find a case where it does, we should make sure it's not changing the behavior.
Right, that's not what I was concerned. I was more concerned like accidentally specifying a value for leaveOpen when you meant to specify detect byte order encoding and things like that.
Yeah, because there's two bools in this. And I think that's always first. So it would only be if the ordering got reversed somehow and where the bulls are flipped.
There are two bulls
Right.
after. What's the second bull?
There's detect coding for byte order marks and leaveOpen.
Oh yeah, okay.
Are we not just going to make a constructor with the most arguments have all the default parameters?
Yeah. I'm just saying if one of the smaller ones has those two bulls reversed,
Yeah, but it
that would
doesn't
cause the problem, right?
It doesn't make sense though to do all of that because you would never specify both an encoding and a detect encoding value argument at the same time. They're in conflict.
Fair enough.
Is that true?
Well, I mean, you could say detect encoding, but use this as the fallback. Because there's plenty of times where UTF-8, which is our default fallback, is not the correct default fallback.
So does that mean we actually have two different constructors with the quote largest number of arguments?
But those would be on StreamReader though, not StreamWriter. StreamWriter has StreamWriter never ever looks at existing stuff.
And we're talking about both though, right?
Well, right now we don't have one with all five.
Right, but we have two with four.
Yes.
Right. So how do we specify
we would have
with four with optional arguments? Is that possible?
We would have to add a fifth.
So guys, you're losing the room. All right.
There is a stream reader that takes stream encoding, detective coding for byte order marks and buffer size.
Buy online,
Yeah,
people.
okay, sure.